Thanks so much for joining us for today's event. My name is Jill Owens-Lee, and I'm a marketing manager at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many great events we're looking forward to is author Vanessa Veselka in conversation with Kristen Arnett on Wednesday, August 26th. They'll discuss Veselka's new novel, The Great Offshore Grounds. Please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you haven't already done so, please sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Today, we're so honored to welcome Hilary Moore and James Tracy, the authors of No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and Lessons for Today's Movements, in conversation with Mark Bray. Hilary Moore is an anti-racist political educator who teaches with generative somatics. She works on the leadership team of Showing Up for Racial Justice and is the author of Organizing Cools the Planet, Tools and Reflections to Navigate the Climate Crisis, and also Burning Earth, Changing Europe, How the Racist Right Exploits the Climate Crisis and What We Can Do About It. James Tracy is an author, organizer, and an instructor of labor and community studies at City College of San Francisco. He is the co-author of Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels and Black Power, Community Organizing in Radical Times, and also Dispatches Against Displacement, Field Notes from San Francisco's Housing Wars. Today's book, No Fascist USA, is the story of how a national grassroots network fought a resurgence of the KKK and other fascist groups during the Reagan years, with tactics including exposing white supremacists in public office, confronting neo-Nazis in street protests, supporting movements for self-determination, and engagement with the underground punk scene, and how this group laid the groundwork for many anti-racist efforts to emerge since. Hilary and James are joined in conversation by Mark Bray, a political organizer and historian of human rights, terrorism, and politics in modern Europe. He is the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, and his work has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, Salon, Boston Review, and numerous edited volumes. He is currently a lecturer at Rutgers University. This event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Hilary Moore, James Tracy, and Powell's by purchasing a copy of the book, No Fascist USA. A link to buy the book will be shared in the chat this afternoon. Hilary, James, and Mark, it's an honor to welcome you all today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for that introduction, Jill. Thanks, Hilary and James, for inviting me to chat about your fantastic book. So I'm going to just chat for a minute or two about the book, and then we're going to get into a conversation and then do questions. So I really greatly enjoyed reading this book. I encourage people to check it out. And it was interesting to me because it made me think about how the history of anti-fascism is conceptualized in general, because particularly post-war anti-fascism up until recent years has been considered a very marginal phenomenon and not something considered historically interesting or worthwhile. In a lot of countries, including the US, a lot of post-war anti-fascist efforts involved relatively small groups of people, not your mass workers' parties of the 20s and 30s, confronting far-right threats that were not on the scale of Hitler's Nazi party. And so in that sense, they've been kind of, on the sidelines. Even I think the way that most Americans, especially in states that were not particularly affected by Klan violence in recent decades, think about the history of the Klan is to think that by the 1980s, that was largely over, that was something you think about when you learn about the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. That was not the case, as you'll see when you read No Fascist USA. And so when I wrote my book about anti-fascism, I included about 1.5 pages about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And when I was doing some research about it, minimal research, I read through some other books that had mentioned stuff about them. It was usually a page or two here or there. And the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was spoken about often as kind of a footnote after the quote unquote golden age of armed struggle in the 60s and 70s. I had the fortune of meeting some of the old John Brown comrades in the Bay Area when I came out a few years ago. And I remember Terry Bisson said that they came out of what he called the quote unquote weather debris, right? So even phrasing it that way, the notion that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee came out of this debris suggests that this is the sort of footnote end of a story and not the story itself. But what Hilary and James do in really delving into what the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee did, what they stood for, and thinking about what that was about in light of recent developments over recent decades, is to say that we don't need to think, or rather shouldn't think, of John Brown as the end of a story, as the sort of product of decay and then end, but actually in a different way is the beginning of a different story that is very much still being told today about committed groups of anti-fascists and anti-racists doing whatever they can wherever they are to confront the growth of a far-right threat before it gets even worse than it already is. So it's a really, I think, thinking about the fact that, it's no coincidence that I think that Hilary and James wrote this book recently and not 20 years ago, right? This is something that we're grappling with now, and it shows how historical phenomena are always sort of subject to this kind of reinterpretation based on what comes after them even. So it was a pleasure to read No Fascist USA. It is not only a history of what John Brown, I'm just going to call it John Brown rather than do the whole acronym. So I'm not talking about the historical figure John Brown, but the John Brown Committee, or you folks call it the committee, right? So that's a useful way. I also call it the committee. The John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, the book delves into the kind of recollections and reflections of many of the members, what they think they got right, plenty of things they got wrong. And that was really interesting. I was struck particularly about the story. I think, again, it was Terry who told the story about trying to pressure a mother of three at the supermarket to join the anti-racist struggle by essentially yelling at her about something. You can clarify the story, but, and reflecting like, hey, maybe that's not the best way to go about it. Like those moments, maybe we haven't had that exact experience, but, we've all had our moments as politically involved people where we look back years later and say, oh, gee, that could have gone better. So it reads in a very relatable way, draws a lot from the lessons and experiences of the organizers, but also brings James and Hilary's critical lens about the limitations of what John Brown was about, how they were in some ways ahead of their time, but also, like every initiative, very much stuck in their time in other ways. And I also think that what's also fascinating about the book is if you take a moment to recognize just how many interrelated nexes of American and international radical politics you can get to by studying the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, because Hilary and James also get into all of their coalition efforts, their relations with the Republic of New Africa, with other kinds of anti-racist groups. And so in that way, it's a great snapshot of a corner of radical history, and really is very useful for thinking about how we're going to fight back today, how we can, as radicals, which I assume many viewers are today, think about also working with people with different politics and the ways to go about doing that. So I'm not going to go on too much longer, but I want to ask, I have a bunch of questions. I'm not going to get to all of them, because I also want to hear from audience questions, because I see some people are popping up in the chats. But to start out with, I'm curious what brought you to the topic. What about, because I mean, we can't write about everything, right? There's a reason why we pick the topics we pick. What was it that pulled you two in? How did you get to work together? And what was co-writing the book like for you two? I'm just curious, as a writer, how did you each have a certain focus? Did you write separate sections? What did you learn from each other, or what aspects of each other's methodologies did you challenge with each other? Anything along those lines, I'd be really curious to hear about.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, pals. Thanks, Mark. Hello, everybody joining us. Thanks for all those wonderful things you said about our book. It made me like the book even more, so I appreciate that. Yeah, I talk a little bit about why the book in the author's preface, but there's of course more to it. And the two main pieces that I kind of reference of like why this book and why now. And the first one really poignantly was in the summer of 2016, and it was the lead up to Trump's presidential campaign towards the presidency. And long story short, there were two different white supremacist groups who petitioned, who got a permit to have a rally in Sacramento, California, where I was born. And I was also a staff member at Catalyst Project, which is an anti-racist political education collective in the Bay Area. And a few of us went out there mostly just to be able to prevent white supremacists from having a public forum and having a public presence, and to keep people safe. That was our intention. And that was the first time I saw anybody get stabbed. And that was actually pretty brutal and traumatic. And from that moment, trying to make sense of how it is that doing anti-racist political education for years and building up people's analysis, engagement, campaigns, grassroots work, how I felt really underprepared, and I think the people around me felt really underprepared. So then what do you do when there's actual white supremacists, like actual people around you, and taking up political space and gaining more attention in an accelerated way with Trump doing his campaign. And so it was that moment of like trauma, and it was like a grab, as well as having done work with folks in Arkansas and Kentucky and Tennessee, and also those folks who have a lot less resource than folks in the Bay around anti-racism and getting messages out. And a lot of people in those grassroots groups were like, we want models, we want other examples of how people have done confrontation work, but in a way that is really rooted in an anti-racist politic grounded in a different kind of history. And so, yeah, as a Catalyst Project member, I started to reach out to mentors that were around our organization, and a few folks like Linda Evans and Donna Wilmot, people who had been a part of anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles. And just mostly I just started asking them questions of like, what the fuck do we do? And what advice and perspective do you have? And started to have those conversations. And James is a dear friend of mine, and I just started to talk with him about some of those conversations. And over lunch, we kind of decided like, well, we should write a book about it. Like there's enough similarities of, a very right-wing, far right-wing president, and shifting what that was shifting on the ground and in the streets for far right movements and white supremacists, and what was being politically possible, what was opening up. And there were just too many similarities not to write something, or not to try to pull out some of the lessons that people were asking for. James can say a lot more about that, but a few things about co-writing. I think we both like really took turns on different chapters and different things. Like we started with where we were excited about. I mean, I feel like James is the poet. James is like super, he'll probably go a lot more into it, but like really into like the politics and the cultural piece around music. And so that part of the story really got enlivened. I'm pretty much a nerd for like detailing the shit out of any story and like finding all the facts and details. I think I wrote like 15 pages just on who Ronald Reagan was, and that had to get dramatically cut down for chapter 2 or 3 or something like that. So I think we have different skills that complement each other, but really we started the chapters that we were kind of excited about, and then we would change and switch and add to them. So it was really collaborative. And then I moved, I think we did the project in 4 years, and almost towards the end I moved to Germany. So that was really interesting to write a book in different time zones in different countries. Yeah.
Well, so I want to acknowledge the fact that we have at least 3 former members, if there is a possibility of being a former member of John Brown, because as we talk about in the book, members of John Brown Anti-Klan Committee were organizers and revolutionaries and activists before John Brown, and they continue to be an inspiration. I was always fascinated by the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee because when I was 19, they were an inspiring force in my life. The town that I grew up in, Vallejo, California, right on the outskirts between Vallejo and Napa, had a bunch of skinheads trying to organize a thing called the Aryan Woodstock, and John Brown Anti-Klan Committee led the counter mobilization. So I first met them when I bought a newspaper from them, and a part of the left gone by that I really appreciate is people willing to stand out on a corner and share ideas with one another. But the writing process, I wrote this book mainly because from living through the 80s and seeing a lot, some of this stuff unfold right in my, in my own town and also nearby, like Richmond. I think that there's a lot of debates that we have about the far right that we treat like if they're brand new, right? But actually a lot of the, a lot of what we recognize as today's far right had such roots in the 80s, from rhetorical and organizing strategies that they carry on to the way that we who oppose fascism react to having a very complex movement required to confront the rise. So and I wrote, largely I entered in this book because my good friend Hilary wanted to write a book with me, and I didn't want to turn that opportunity down. I knew I was going to learn a lot.
Cool. That's great stuff. So I guess my first more content question is around the role of ideology in anti-racist and anti-fascist work. Certainly the kinds of political influences and traditions and contexts that we're going with JBAC, right? That JBAC drew from were markedly different in many ways from anti-racist action, for example, which emerged in the late 80s into the 90s, right? Whereas JBAC was drawing from really a kind of global surge of Marxist, Leninist, anti-imperial politics, very much with an eye on various different revolutions happening around the world, and with a kind of macro level analysis about the relationship between white supremacy and the work they were doing and so forth. The immediate influence of anti-racist action, for example, was the British anti-fascist action, and presumably the notion of the John Brown comrades drawing their most immediate influence from a bunch of British punks wouldn't have been their first choice, right? So I'm wondering how you think that the role of, there you go, the role of ideology plays into that. And then I just wanted to just tack something else on, is I was interested in how you two dealt / didn't deal as much as I might have expected with the question of violence. It seems like you both made an effort to emphasize all of the other ways that the John Brown comrades organized, and even your description sometimes of confrontations didn't spend as much time on that aspect as one might think, given the association between John Brown's politics and their militant confrontation. So I'm curious as to your thought process and vision around dealing with that issue, which of course has come to dominate anti-fascist really conversations in general.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in a very basic way, I feel like how ideology then shapes how an organization and people position themselves is really like provides a foundation and how people read a political landscape. That's kind of how I understand how the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was very much rooted in anti-imperialism and very much rooted in like what the empire of the US is doing outside of its nation's borders, and then how that relates to what's happening inside. And they wrote extensively about these pieces and how they were interrelated, and seeing how particularly the Klan was playing a kind of role, right? It's a quite different role, but a related role to what the police are doing, to what the FBI was doing, to what wars were doing across borders, but mostly it's about controlling people, land, labor, resources. And then the organizationally then was making assessments about what they thought was most effective in terms of making a political line, like putting out a political vision, mostly rooted in supporting the organizations that were fighting for self-determination. That was like a huge organizing principle of the actual organization, which I think is an important lesson for today, of like, what if our anti-racist and anti-fascist movements were actually organized around solely, like in a compelling way, like supporting movements for self-determination, and then what that might look like, and then how that led to anti-Klan work. And I feel like there's an important example of like how these differences now, you know, come out in the actual work of doing anti-Klan work. And so if there's any nerds who already have the book in front of you and you want to turn to page 122, I'll just read a couple of pieces from that. So 122, it says, the rally in Scotland, and this is Connecticut, foreshadowed growing differences among anti-Klan groups. So kind of, you know, underlying this is like with different ideologies. A group's tactics for how to best stop the Klan were based on that group's assessment of the Klan and potential threat it posed. Was the Klan a symbolic fringe group, a nonviolent organization for law and order, a terrorist organization, or something else? Each group answered those questions differently, and as a result, their tactics for countering the Klan ranged from face-to-face confrontations to ignoring the Klan and holding alternative events such as prayer circles for peace. For anti-Klan organizers, the question of who controlled narratives about race relations mattered, because such narratives shaped whether or not the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee's efforts were seen as welcome resistance or unwelcome provocation. And I feel like that was pretty in the air in this time. I mean, not a lot is written about the anti-Klan movement in the 80s, but there were plenty of different kinds of ways people were taking anti-Klan and Klan-related groups, like action against them. And then I think towards maybe in the later 80s, John Brown Anti-Klan Committee had a newspaper that they put out pretty regularly. And then they were starting to have dialogues with other kinds of anti-Klan groups saying like, yeah, we have different politics. Yeah, we do things this kinds of way, but particularly around free speech, particularly around whether or not we get seen as violent, and then how the state relates to us in challenging white supremacists. Like, this is a really important dividing point in which the anti-Klan movement is getting more weak around that. So I thought that was a really interesting contribution from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, is like, hey, we have different positions here, and can we like come to some sort of coordination around the ways that the how dominant society, mainstream society, relates to violence, relates to who's willing to take you know, physical confrontation with anti-Klan or with Klan members, or as well as just actually naming white supremacy, right? This was a political moment in which it wasn't so common to actually say white supremacy, white supremacists. So they were confrontational in a few different kinds of ways. James, what do you got?
Yeah, I think on the issue of violence, if you actually look, if you look at the history of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, there wasn't a lot of instances where JBAC, you know, threw the first punch. I mean, so there's a very, you know, they upheld the need to counter-mobilize always, right, to drive the Nazis out, and they did a pretty damn good job of getting a lot of people out there to do that. But it was largely under a community self-defense model, so they certainly weren't pacifists by any stretch of the imagination. But they're, you know, but when we say violence, it wasn't like they were just running out and let's charge the Nazis right away. With some exceptions, I think there was something about some interesting sandwiches being thrown with cement in them or something like that. But for the most part, they upheld the right of people, of community self-defense for oppressed communities and our allies to not only have to respond non-violently or in a pacifist way. Mostly it was done through counter mobilizations.
I think, yeah, go ahead. Hilary, did
Unless you want to follow up with that, but I kind of want to ask you a related question.
Oh,
so
sure, yeah,
sure.
We'll go back and forth. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. I mean, just this topic, right, of like mass movements involving a wide variety of tactics and how that looks depending on where you are and what that is necessary, especially around direct confrontation. I think James and I are both interested in like in your activism as well as your scholarship and how they're related. What are effective ways in bridging some of those divides that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like any kind of example of bridging those divides has examples where a given strategy has worked and examples where that very same strategy has failed. So I don't want to make too grand an assessment, but you know, from speaking to the interview subjects I spoke to in my Antifa book from different places in Sweden and other places, there have been fruitful examples of coming together for specific counter mobilizations. We can think in the US, even just counter mobilizations in Charlottesville against Unite the Right, or a year later against Unite the Right 2, which featured different kinds of anti-racist, anti-fascist, radical environmentalist student groups coming together. I spoke with some of the anti-fascists who helped organize the Charlottesville counter protests, and they said that in advance, they had a kind of spokes council where different organizers came to community agreements on what kinds of tactics and strategies they would or would not pursue for this specific event. And it seems that similar kinds of conversations happened in the John Brown days, and I'm sure in other kinds of circles. I don't know if that sparks any. James, did you want to jump in on that, or?
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
okay.
But I was nodding because I agreed with what you were saying. But
yeah, and so right, so that's a way that, like, for example, more militant anti-fascist groups and political parties or unions have come together. But I've also heard stories from anti-fascists about sometimes when the kind of political winds blow in a different direction, unions, large unions or political parties not wanting to entertain the perspectives and strategical proposals of less mainstream radicals. The other thing that I think is interesting and a little bit potentially more fraught is the question of having phone. I gotta silence my stupid phone. Is having people of very different political tendencies within the same group, which it doesn't seem that John Brown folks did or would have even countenanced. Right, it seems like coming out of a kind of Marxist-Leninist tradition where you would have more of a kind of uniformity within groups, but a lot of the ARA groups of the 90s or current anti-fascist groups have social democrats and anarchists and communists and liberals coming together, which I'm sure presents its own kinds of challenges, but also its own kinds of opportunities. So that's another way that I was thinking about ideology potentially informing or influencing what it means to do this work, both at a kind of coalition level and within groups. So again, there's no golden bullet, but I think thinking about organizing for around events, I think that the notion of diversity of tactics can be a promising way of coexisting, but also, like any other political slogan, can be abused if people aren't actually committed to creating opportunities for different kinds of spaces for resistance. Yeah. And either of you want to jump in on that?
I'll add. I mean, I haven't been in Portland for 2 years, so I don't want to presume to tell another city what's working and what's not. But from what I've seen, just from readings, Pop Mob has been doing a pretty good job, at least thinking through ways of structuring multiple ways to participate, in counter mobilization. So people don't have to be all comfortable with the exact same tactics. And there seems to be a lot of thoughtfulness as far as informed consent around these type of tactics and geographically situating things so there's less risk in some areas and higher risk in others. So, those of you who live in Portland, I might be wrong, and it might be a total disaster, but it does seem like Pop Mob has some real insights and an active experiment into building a real diversity of tactics.
Yeah, Pop Mob seems fantastic. and I think it also points to the notion that beyond what we do, we can promote certain kinds of principles that create space for different forms of resistance in the context of anti-fascist organizing around notions of no platform for fascism, the legitimacy of self-defense, and not turning to the police to arrest our comrades, even if we disagree with what they do, are you know, a few starting points that can help set the table for fruitful collaboration. Shall we move on to some related topics? Because I had a question that feeds into, unless either of you wanted to.
Go for it.
So the relationship between the far right and the police is central to all of this, right? The notion of a three-right fight, you might say, or even the notion that the far right and the police are not necessarily as distinct entities as one might think. So, you know, how does studying JBAC, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, give us some insight into how to think about that? How did they deal with that issue?
Totally, yeah. One thing that surprised me, or, you know, whatever, I was born in 1985, so this organization came into being in 1977, so that's a fair amount of time before I was a politically conscious person. But one thing that surprised me in the research and talking with people and kind of piecing some of the stories and context together was that in the time, you know, 77 to mostly like 92, and of course there's the spirit and aspects of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee still alive today, but that's kind of the time period that we looked at for the organization in the book. And one thing that was surprising to me is in some conversation with other people who took more of like a civil rights approach to doing anti-Klan work, is that there was a lot more coordination, conversation, authorities. So like anti-Klan folks working with the FBI and working with police. And this was because it was a moment in which the far right or the white power movement had declared war against the US government. And so in some ways it was like a friend who were both against the Klan, right? So different anti-Klan members, yeah. So that just surprised me because I have grown up in a political moment where in general, you don't trust the police. And in general, you kind of understand the relationship between, there's like a commonality or some sort of like shared positioning of like, yeah, maybe it's neo-Nazis, but you also need to watch your back because of the police as well. Like they do different kinds of work, but they're not on your side. And so what I appreciated about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is they were, from my perspective, an early white anti-racist group who believed that the police cannot be reformed and that the police function exactly as they are and as they were intended. And I feel like those narratives are still relevant today, right? Like kind of naming the police for what they are. And they did that with campaigns like Blue by Day and White by Night. And the cops and the Klan go hand in hand, right? And they didn't think that the Klan was a lunatic fringe that was like on the edges of society, but rather reflected a racist motivation that is common within mainstream society and is part of white racist sentiment in the US. And so they focused on collaboration mostly, like how Klan members and Klan-like groups were collaborating and sharing information. They talked about alignment, how the Klan was doing a kind of work of, you know, controlling and harassing in a different way that the police does. They talked about involvement, so shared membership, and they also talked about infiltration. And so these are all different ways that they talked about how the far right and the police relate to each other. And I think that that's very important as like a foundation because not a lot of groups were doing that at that time. And that's a part of what I believe is now part of more commonly held anti-fascist, anti-racist understanding. And I think some of the pieces that weren't so obvious at that time being in that political moment, but we can look back now and kind of see the differences is like in 1983 when the white power movement declared war against the US government and the Klan became disillusioned with authorities and trying to maintain a certain kind of relationship to the US government. I feel like that is an interesting lesson for today. And Matthew Lyons writes a lot about this and insurgent supremacists, but just basically that there's now, especially with like the far right, less interested in being a mass organization necessarily, and kind of a charismatic shifting of persona like the Klan was doing in the 70s, but it is a bit more underground, right? There are different kinds of actions being taken, like, you know, leaderless resistance, if you will. And just, I want to pull out like one lesson for today is there's not one single story in how these institutions relate to the far right.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's so many things that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee were, you know, I don't know if you could say that it was just absolutely spot on analysis or whether they were
you know, white supremacists. And so there's a nuanced reality that we can, in our anti-racist movements, in our anti-fascist movements, kind of pull out like, yeah, sometimes the FBI, they do that, needs to be understood because there's lots of different kinds of relationships there, but we can't.
Hilary, are you with us? James, do you want to step in to say what you were going to say?
Yeah, and hopefully there are some tech issues going on, still are. Hopefully it didn't sound like I was talking over Hilary there. So there's so many things about the history of John Brown and their analysis that you could either characterize as absolutely spot on for the time or even prophetic in many ways. They're challenging anti-fascists to tie our work to an analysis around imperialism and the ways that that the military and the police are infiltrated by the and reinforce white supremacy. Absolutely spot on. I think our editor Greg challenged us around this to really think through this, because he kept pointing out times when the FBI or the federal government went into combat against the far right, and certainly those things happened. So do cops and Klan go hand in hand? Yes, they do. And there are exceptions, because once the genie comes out of the bottle, there's multiple sites of conflict. But I think that the essential analysis of JBAC around these issues is really spot on, and some of the things that are most instructive for those of us trying to figure out effective tactics and approaches today.
Hilary, are you with us?
I hope so.
Yep.
Am I? You tell me.
You are. Did you want to continue what you were saying?
No, that's cool. James and I think alike, so he probably said stuff. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Can I ask the same question of you? Like, how have you seen these tendencies through history? You've done a bunch of work. Like, your book is a lot of history.
Yeah. So I'm a historian of Europe, and Europe was very influential in my book and how I came to think about these things. And I think it's interesting to see how the police and the state as a whole became a kind of wedge to divide two very large different anti-fascist camps after World War II in Europe. Because on the one hand, you had different socialist and communist parties who argued that the way to stop another Nazi or fascist party from coming to power was to make it illegal to do Nazi or fascist things. And so the state, the courts, considered themselves anti-fascist institutions, and the status quo was considered anti-fascist. And then on the other hand, as the decades went along, the kind of militant anti-fascist tradition that develops in contradistinction to that, largely among different kinds of autonomists and anti-authoritarians, is to say that, well, number one, a lot of these supposedly anti-fascist states actually have a bunch of fascists in them. Number two, the fascist threat's not gone. And number three, if we want to understand what fascism is and how it's developed historically, we need to think about capitalism and authoritarianism and imperialism and so forth. And so seeing that the police and the state and fascism not as different or perhaps as being on a kind of spectrum with each other. And so in that sense, not necessarily anti-statism, but state skepticism at the very least is sort of baked into what modern militant anti-fascism has meant in Europe. And that tradition, of course, was very influential for anti-racist action and groups that came subsequently, seemingly not as influential or possibly not influential at all for the John Brown comrades. If you came across research that, you know, complicates that picture, I'd be curious to hear about, but it seems like that really wasn't what they were looking at or reading with good reason. So in that sense, I think today when we think about the relationship between anti-fascism and the cops and Klan, that's relevant. As a kind of a bit of a side note, it came to my attention recently that there are self-described Antifa police in Brazil. There are these cops down there who are anti-Bolsonaro, who wear Antifa shirts that say Antifa with the red and black flags and consider themselves Antifa cops. And I've tried to explain that while police could conceivably be part of that statist anti-fascist tradition, this anti-statist, anti-police tradition is at odds. It's a paradox, a contradiction that can't really be resolved. So no, I don't think there could be Antifa cops, although there could be, in the kind of statist sense, police who are against fascism. But then again, that's sort of reducing the question to this lowest common denominator, which is very much not what the John Brown folks were about, which is digging beneath the kind of superficial relationship between cops and Klan, and recognizing that even if you have examples of the cops going after the Klan or cops going after the Nazis or states shutting down the far right, that doesn't really address everything that's beneath the surface.
Well said.
Thanks. All right, why don't I shoot one back in your direction? A lot of, especially later on in the book, you have these stories around grand jury resistance, and that's been relevant to radical struggles in recent years. I was just hoping that you two could take a stab at talking through that and what we could learn from that.
Definitely. And if my internet cuts out again, James, just roll with it. Keep going. I feel like there's a ton of information for folks that are really interested in understanding the legacy that is resisting grand juries. I think one of the pieces just to know right off the bat, right, is that grand juries are a way for authorities to gather information, to make a case, to charge someone. And it's basically a way to divide movements. It's basically a way to gather information and pit people against each other and to isolate each other. And so if you already don't know, just go to grandjuryresistance.org. And there's also tons of books, tons of resources, also lots of examples for grand jury resistance now, but also through the decades. And I think one of the most important pieces I want to throw out, if you don't know already, is just a really rich history of many movements resisting grand juries. And so I would want to just make it appealing as possible if you are approached by the FBI or other authorities to participate in a grand jury. I think just it's worth saying, like, don't talk to the FBI. We all know that. But my question is, like, does your neighbor know that? And does your auntie know that? And is that a conversation that we can make, you know, as homegrown as like borrowing a cup of sugar, you know? So I feel like the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was already within that tradition of resistance. It wasn't a question for folks if they would participate or not. And they made it very public, basically, of like being approached. You know, Terry Bisson has written a poem, James, if you could put it in the chat, that's basically really turning an invitation to participate in a grand jury, kind of positioning it within that legacy of resistance and kind of making it a thing to organize around and bring more awareness to other people who have either are in prison for resisting grand juries or other political prisoners. And I feel like that was why it was so available to John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, is because from the beginning, all through and well beyond the organization, they were organized around supporting political prisoners and supporting the folks that are most targeted by counterintelligence program, as well as just the state. And so often those are leaders of color, people fighting for self-determination. So what I really appreciated about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is like they were already just in that milieu or in that understanding, and then got to be creative with it. Tracy?
Yeah, I think this reminds me a lot of the famous essay that Henry David Thoreau wrote in defense of Captain John Brown. One could mainly, could certainly surmise that Henry David Thoreau and John Brown disagreed on a lot of things, right, about how change is made. But when the chips were down, Henry David Thoreau defended John Brown publicly and vocally, and I think that's the type of ethics that we need. It is absolutely natural and desirable to have a movement with many different ideologies and approaches to change making. It's healthy. Our debates hopefully will help us sharpen our analysis and become more effective. But the number one thing is as we learn from each other, we don't publicly denounce each other over tactics. We don't testify against one another. If the grand jury, when the grand jury comes knocking, when the subpoena arrives, that we our differences amongst each other can be handled from in private ways, in organization to organization, but we stand up for each other, even if in the short term we may or may not agree with the exact tactics there. It's always has an avalanche. One John Brown Anti-Klan member, a former member who did some time in prison, Linda Evans, told me about how when she was in federal prison, she was right alongside people who were arrested, alongside activities with the Berrigans, right? The very famous Catholic pacifist group. The state doesn't care about any of us, right? The federal government doesn't care whether, whether you're a black masked black blocker, or they don't care if you're a religious pacifist. If you are confronting fascism and racism and imperialism in whatever ways, you're going to be a target. So I think that's I was so inspired by all the people like Terry and Pam and many others who just said, no, we're not talking, not talking to the FBI during this time, and they paid a price. They went to prison for a short amount of time, but the consequences of them playing fast and loose with those ethics would have endangered many people in the movement.
Can I throw in again? I'm going to put a resource in the chat box. It's a resource from my old organization, Catalyst Project, and it talks about state repression, which is highly relevant to what's happening in Portland. It's highly relevant for what's happening many places in the US and beyond. But it basically talks about the role of white folks in relationship to state repression, and how often, very much, and Marilyn Buck talks a lot about this, of how like white folks tend to be a weak link in relationship to what the state's willing to do, applying pressure to get more information about the movements that they are really targeting. And the toolkit, the link there is super intelligent. I really appreciate how accessible it is for people in groups, in affinity groups, in organizations to think through, do we have our principles? Have we had this conversation? What do we need to think through so that we feel ready, we feel confident, we feel able to navigate what happens when there's repression, whether it's from police or federal authorities. So I just highly recommend that piece, that link, and then also kind of put John Brown in relationship to that, right? Like they were part of a legacy and organization, but why they were successful in grand jury resistance is they knew that their role was a very particular one in which the state was willing to, or wanting to, like apply pressure to access the folks that they were connected to. So I feel like that's a necessary lesson.
Great. So James suggested we create some space here for Bill, former or as James described, current, eternal John Brown Anti-Klan Committee organizer to share a poem. Bill, if you can hear us, you are muted. There you go.
Yes, hi everyone.
Hi, Bill.
Hey,
Hey,
Hilary,
Bill.
James. Mark, I met you when you came out to the Bay Area.
Hi, Bill.
You're in Oakland. And also special thanks to Hilary and James for uh, having me as a companion on their book tour. I've been able to read a poem at different bookstores that they've launched their book. I read a poem about Assata Shakur. I read a poem about the rebellion in LA after the beating of Rodney King. I am a veteran of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and I was interviewed by James for this great book that Hilary and James have written. This is a little shift of direction. It's a poem that's autobiographical, I guess part of my origin story. I'm not a superhero, but I was born in Connecticut, and when I was 2 years old, my father was drafted into the Army and sent to the deep segregated South to Army camps. And my young mother took me when I was 2 to follow my father around so we wouldn't be separated from him. And so for 4 years, we lived in deeply segregated Mississippi, North Carolina, Northern Florida. And this is from a recent book of mine called War in America. And the title of this poem is The War in America. I didn't see the war in America when I was 4, dressed in my soldier suit, posing for photos on my dad's shoulder at the Carolina base. My eyes drawn past the barracks at black men in stripes and shackles, stumbling off the flatbed truck at the edge of the woods. Their clanking chains in the turpentine pines around us, laying a silence as black women boiling lye and fat for soap set aside paddles. Black pitch gatherers rested machetes to watch the prisoners scythe the drill ground in bitter rhythm. This war my eyes were seeing, I didn't see when I was 4, watching skies for signs of invasion by foreign powers, confident that war, if it came, would come from over there, overseas. From my dad's shoulder, I smiled at the camera thinking, war almost over. Soon we'd be going home to Connecticut. So some people have asked, why I spent the kind of life that also included as an activist the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and that continues to today. This had all the elements of, in this poem, from the earliest age, white supremacy, prisons, concentration camps against black people. I and I'm sure other comrades in this video today have been involved in defense of our political prisoners from the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I just want to say for everyone, we have to remember, free them all, free them all. So thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Bill.
you, Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very powerful. James, you had proposed in the chat seeing if Lisa Roth, also of JBAC, wanted to contribute. I don't know, Lisa, if you're still around, if you feel like saying hi.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
Hi to all of you. And thank you for this wonderful discussion. Is there anything you have in mind that you want me to comment on?
Well, I guess if you don't have something offhand that you wanted to share, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, you know, this book coming out, all this work that you and your comrades did being sort of historicized, look back on a retrospect and being like a source for inspiration today. Like, what's that experience like? What does it make you think? What does it make you feel?
Well, there's part of it that's really bizarre. Although I have to say, it's been a wonderful adventure. And working with Hilary and James, they were so sharp and clear about the things they wanted to know and guiding the conversations that, you know, I mean, we're talking about stuff that happened 40 years ago. So for us, it was rather a stomp down memory lane, but it was also having to dredge up a lot of stuff that we haven't thought about in a long time and reanalyze it in light of the things that we know today, which was very interesting. And I have to say, and I don't say this in a self-aggrandizing way, but everything that's happened since the George Floyd murder and the pandemic have been very graphic examples to me of how much of our analysis was spot on in 1970. I mean, everything that Hilary was saying earlier about the police and white supremacy was exactly what, I mean, today people consider it common knowledge and obvious that white supremacy and the police are completely intertwined. But that was considered a completely off the charts wild opinion in the 70s. Likewise, issues like reparations and white privilege are discussed today like a normal and logical part of any anti-racist conversation. But, you know, back then, people thought you were nuts if you talked about reparations. I mean, a couple of years ago, I remember hearing Mitch McConnell, somebody asked him a question about reparations and he was like, oh, that's ridiculous. None of us were around or responsible for what happened then. Well, that was the position of the white left until 10 years ago. And so when it's been interesting to me now and very encouraging to see in the movements of today, the embracing of these concepts and I think the forward motion is very positive. I also think, and I hope it sticks, that the implicit embrace of Black leadership is really positive. Mm-hmm. And all of this, I think, unfortunately, you know, the relationship, this is the last thing I'll say. Donald Trump has made white supremacy a mass movement in a way that before the Klan and the Aryan Nations and other organizations like that, they always existed. They were always mobilizing, but they had not successfully made white supremacy a mass movement in the way that, say, Martin Luther King made civil rights a mass movement. But Donald Trump has succeeded in doing that. And now the pandemic has succeeded in showing the true nature of America's working class. The mythical white working class in the United States has really been unveiled in the pandemic. The true workers are the front-line workers and the people who are hardest hit by the pandemic. That's all for now.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Good to
Thank
hear
you,
you.
Lisa.
Yeah.
Good to
So
nice to hear from you. Oh, you take it away, James.
Oh, one of the many wonderful things about putting this book together was getting to have dinner with Lisa and just chop it up on these ideas. I just wanted to say that, and we should go to question and answer because I'm sure we have a few questions.
Well, we only have one. Oh, now we have two. Okay. Okay, so let's just, since we don't have much time, let me just throw both out. The first is, can you discuss the relationship between quote unquote Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and if possible in the context of Portland? And the other one is, quite a few times thus far, y'all referenced that some of JBAC's ideas and tactics have definitely influenced ongoing Antifa organizing. Sorry if I missed it, but I'm not sure I understand. Could you talk about the ways that this is true and also how that's happened, given that your book, for example, is also only recently published? How has there been that sort of intergenerational continuity? Jill from Powell's, I'm not sure how much time we want to go over, but maybe we could take a stab at that array of topics and then wrap it up. Sound good, Jill?
Yeah, that sounds great. That's fine.
Oh, okay. Do either Hilary or James want to take a stab at any of that?
Sure. Yeah. What do you got, James? I heard a breath moment.
Yeah, so thank you for these really incisive questions. I'm going to take a stab at Kathy's question first. So as has been very very talked about, especially lately in the news, you know, there's no Antifa headquarters or anything like that. It's a movement of many different groups and many, you know, ranging in many different tactics and ideologies, all united in the efforts to push back the fascist tide. And Black Lives Matter exists both as actual organizations and chapters and as a larger movement. So it's a little bit harder to talk about the direct relationships in that context, but they're both parts of the you know, of the pushback against you know, against the resurgence of fascism in the United States. You see a lot of influence and debate between people who are attracted to one of these two poles of the movement. But I would say that as it affects Portland, you probably would be a better person to talk about that than us. We don't live in Portland. It seems like Portland, in my opinion, has been kind of an experiment of the far right to figure out how to target what is seen as a liberal city that is emblematic of most of the things that they at least in its outward persona, a contradiction of the things that the far right wants to discipline, and because of that, there people affiliated with Antifa ideas and inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement have had to do its counter experiment on how to mobilize and counter mobilize. So I hope that helps a little bit, and thank you for your question.
Hilary, you want to chime in?
Cool. Yeah, for sure. I'll take Doug's question and then go where I want to with it, just for transparency. Yeah, I feel like one of the coolest things about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and why it's a really worthy organization to study and look at for today's context is to see how the principles of the organization and also how the organization changed over time. Like both of those things being true, right? Like these principles being the same, but how the organization shaped itself, the kinds of actions they took, the coalitions they built, how they changed over time. And then well beyond the organization is one of the most interesting pieces. Like how do our politics and principles shift with the political landscape and adjust with the political landscape? And I feel like the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is a really important example. I mean, there's plenty that is resonant today in like today's anti-fascist movements, but what we talk about explicitly in the book and how the organization moved forward is that the people and those principles continued in other movements, right? They were in the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And then after that organization kind of completed in its own way, folks went into ACT UP and were doing AIDS activism and were really effective in that. And they were doing work against the prison industrial complex as that was starting to emerge, and supporting folks who were most impacted by AIDS in prison. And these different movements, how they had their own expression. So sure, there's absolutely influence from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee into anti-fascist work today. Not to say that John Brown or the committee was like the only thing, but like no platforming, solidarity, you know, building up, being strongly connected to each other, having each other's backs. Those are all pieces that people practice today. But I would strongly recommend reading the lessons section and kind of looking at how folks were doing work around AIDS activism and around prisons for lessons. Yeah. I'm done.
Before we wrap up, I just want to quickly put on people's radar, if you don't know, that Facebook has started banning a number of different anti-fascist and anarchist pages in this effort at both sidesism of we're going to ban the far right, we're going to ban the far left. And so this should really ring people's alarm bells as far as pushing back against the effort of corporations to limit radical expression.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us at Powell's for today's event. It was such a pleasure and such a fascinating conversation. Please consider purchasing a copy of No Fascist USA by visiting us at powells.com. And while you're there, be sure to check up our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. We look forward to seeing you at another one of our events soon. Hilary, James, Mark, thanks again. We're so grateful. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.